The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as Prince Alexander walked through the corridors he had known since childhood. His footsteps echoed in the vast hallway, each step carrying the weight of a decision that would shake the very foundations of the royal family. In his hands, he carried a small velvet box that contained more than precious stones. It held memories, love, and a mother's legacy that had been locked away for far too long. Princess Elena had been gone for 15 years now, but her presence still lingered in every corner of the palace. Her laughter had once filled these halls, her kindness had touched every servant and noble alike, and her jewelry had been the talk of kingdoms far and wide. The sapphire necklace, the diamond tiara, the emerald bracelet, each piece told a story of a woman who had captured the hearts of an entire nation. After Elena's tragic death in that terrible car accident, King Frederick had made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of passing the jewelry to his new wife, Queen Isabella, as tradition demanded, he had locked the precious collection away in the royal vault. "These belong to Elena," he had said firmly, "and one day, they will find their rightful place." Queen Isabella had smiled graciously at the time, but those who knew her well could see the flash of anger in her eyes. For years, the jewelry remained hidden, becoming almost mythical among the palace staff. New servants would whisper about the legendary collection, while older ones would share stories of how radiant Princess Elena had looked wearing each piece. The kingdom's people often wondered what had become of their beloved princess's treasures, but the royal family remained silent on the matter. Queen Isabella had her own magnificent collection, of course. The royal treasury was filled with centuries-old pieces that had adorned queens before her. But Elena's jewelry was different. It was modern, it was beloved by the people, and most importantly, it represented a connection to the previous generation that Isabella could never quite claim as her own. Prince Alexander had grown up hearing stories about his mother from everyone except his stepmother. The palace staff would tell him how Princess Elena would spend hours in the children's ward of the royal hospital, how she would personally oversee charity events, and how she would wear her jewelry not as symbols of status, but as reminders of the responsibility that came with her position. Each piece had been carefully chosen for specific occasions, and Elena had always made sure that her appearance served a greater purpose than mere vanity. As Alexander matured, he began to understand the delicate balance his father had tried to maintain. King Frederick loved Queen Isabella. There was no doubt about that. She had brought stability to his life after the chaos of Elena's death, and she had been a devoted stepmother to Alexander and his younger sister, Princess Victoria. But Frederick also knew that erasing Elena's memory completely would damage the royal family's connection to the people, who had adored their former princess. The tension in the palace had been building for months. Queen Isabella had recently begun making subtle suggestions about the jewelry collection. She would mention how lovely it would be to wear Elena's sapphires to the upcoming state dinner, or how the diamond tiara would be perfect for Princess Victoria's upcoming 18th birthday celebration. Each suggestion was made with careful diplomacy, but Alexander could see through the politics. Princess Victoria, now 17 and remarkably similar to her mother in both appearance and spirit, had begun asking questions about Elena's jewelry. She had seen photographs of her mother wearing the pieces, and as she prepared for her debut into royal society, she naturally wondered about her inheritance. The young princess had her father's diplomatic nature, but her mother's fierce independence, and Alexander knew that she would not remain silent about the matter much longer. The palace advisors were divided on the issue. Some believed that Queen Isabella, as the current queen, should have access to all royal jewelry. Others argued that Elena's collection was too closely associated with her memory to be worn by anyone else. The most pragmatic advisors suggested that the jewelry should be displayed in a museum, allowing the people to see the pieces while avoiding the complicated politics of who should wear them. But Alexander had a different idea entirely. He had spent weeks in quiet contemplation, remembering not just his mother's beauty when she wore the jewelry, but the purpose behind each appearance. Elena had never worn her jewels simply to look beautiful. She had worn them to honor the occasions, to show respect for the people she was meeting, and to fulfill her role as a representative of the royal family. Standing in the corridor outside Queen Isabella's private sitting room, Alexander took a deep breath. The conversation he was about to have would change everything. The velvet box in his hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, but he knew that what he was about to do was right. It was what his mother would have wanted, and more importantly, it was what the kingdom needed. The decision he had made would surprise everyone, his father, his stepmother, his sister, and the entire kingdom. But Prince Alexander had learned from his mother's example that sometimes the most powerful moves were the ones that served others rather than oneself. The jewelry would indeed return to public life, but not in the way anyone expected. As he raised his hand to knock on Queen Isabella's door, Alexander smiled slightly. His mother had always said that true nobility came not from the crown on one's head or the jewels around one's neck, but from the courage to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Queen Isabella looked up from her embroidery as Alexander entered her private sitting room. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the elegant furniture that she had personally selected when she became queen. She had always preferred this room for difficult conversations. It was intimate enough to encourage honesty, yet formal enough to maintain the proper royal distance. "Alexander, what a pleasant surprise," Isabella said, setting down her needlework. She had been expecting this conversation for weeks, though she wasn't entirely certain what form it would take. The queen had noticed the prince's thoughtful demeanor lately, the way he would pause when passing portraits of his mother, and the increased frequency of his visits to the royal vault. Alexander remained standing, the velvet box still clutched in his hands. "Your Majesty, I've come to discuss Mother's jewelry collection." His voice was steady, but Isabella could detect the underlying tension. She had watched this young man grow from a grieving boy into a thoughtful prince, and she knew him well enough to recognize when he had made an important decision. "Please, sit." Isabella gestured to the chair across from her. "I've been wondering when this conversation would happen." She kept her tone neutral, though her heart rate had quickened. The jewelry had been a source of quiet frustration for years, a beautiful collection that served no purpose locked away in darkness. Alexander remained standing. "I want to give the collection to someone who will honor Mother's memory properly." The words hung in the air between them, and Isabella felt a surge of hope. Perhaps the prince had finally realized that as the current queen, she was the natural choice to wear Elena's jewels. "That's very thoughtful of you," Isabella replied carefully. "I would be honored to wear Elena's pieces at appropriate state functions. Your mother had exquisite taste, and I believe I could do justice to her legacy." The prince's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes told Isabella that she had misunderstood his intentions. "Actually, Your Majesty, I've decided to give the entire collection to Princess Victoria." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella's embroidery needle slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the marble floor. She stared at Alexander, trying to process what he had just said. Victoria was only 17, still months away from her official debut. She had no experience with state functions, no understanding of the diplomatic significance of royal jewelry choices. "Victoria?" Isabella's voice was barely above a whisper. "But she's just a child. She doesn't understand the responsibility that comes with wearing the crown jewels." Alexander finally sat down, placing the velvet box on the small table between them. "She's the same age Mother was when she first wore the sapphire necklace, and she understands more than you might think." His voice was gentle but firm. "Victoria has been asking about Mother's jewelry for months. She wants to understand her heritage, to connect with the mother she barely remembers." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. She had been queen for over a decade, had stood beside King Frederick through countless state dinners and royal ceremonies. She had earned her place in the royal family through loyalty, grace, and dedication. And now, a teenage girl was going to receive the most coveted jewelry collection in the kingdom simply because of her bloodline. "Alexander, I think you should reconsider," Isabella said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Victoria is lovely, but she's not ready for such responsibility. These pieces require someone with experience, someone who understands the political implications of when and how to wear them." The prince opened the velvet box, revealing the legendary sapphire necklace that had been Elena's favorite. The stones caught the afternoon light, sparkling with an intensity that seemed almost alive. This necklace was worn by Mother when she opened the children's hospital. She chose it specifically because the blue represented hope and healing. Victoria plans to wear it when she begins her charity work with orphaned children. Isabella stared at the necklace. remembering how stunning Elena had looked in all the newspaper photographs from that hospital opening. The image had become iconic, the beautiful princess surrounded by smiling children, her jewelry adding dignity to the occasion rather than overshadowing it. But Victoria could choose from any number of pieces for her charity work. Surely there are other options that would be more appropriate for a young princess. She could, Alexander agreed, but these pieces belong to her mother. They're part of her inheritance, part of who she is. He paused, studying Isabella's face. I know this isn't what you expected, and I understand your disappointment. But I believe this is what Mother would have wanted. The Queen stood up abruptly, walking to the window overlooking the palace gardens. Her mind raced as she tried to find a diplomatic way to change Alexander's mind. What does your father think about this decision? She asked, hoping that King Frederick might have some influence over his son. Father doesn't know yet, Alexander admitted. I wanted to speak with you first out of respect for your position as queen. The courtesy was genuine, but it also served as a reminder that Alexander had made his decision independently. Isabella turned back to face him, her composure beginning to crack. Alexander, I've been part of this family for 15 years. I've supported your father through difficult times. I've been a mother to you and Victoria, and I've served this kingdom faithfully. Doesn't that earn me some consideration? The prince's expression softened with genuine sympathy. Your contributions to our family and kingdom are immeasurable, and I'm grateful for everything you've done. But this isn't about earning or deserving. It's about continuing Mother's legacy in the way she would have wanted. And you think a 17-year-old girl can do that better than the current queen? The question came out more sharply than Isabella had intended, revealing the hurt and frustration she had been trying to hide. Alexander stood up, closing the velvet box and tucking it under his arm. I think Victoria carries Mother's spirit in a way that no one else can. When she talks about using the jewelry for charity work, when she asks about the stories behind each piece, when she looks at Mother's portraits, I see Elena in her eyes. Isabella realized that the conversation was over, that Alexander's mind was made up completely. The jewelry that she had quietly coveted for years, the pieces that would have elevated her status and connected her more deeply to the royal legacy, were going to a teenager who didn't even fully understand their value. When will you tell Victoria? Isabella asked, resigned to the inevitable. Tonight at dinner, Alexander replied. I want the whole family to hear it together. He moved toward the door, then paused. Your Majesty, I hope you understand that this decision comes from love. Love for Mother's memory, love for Victoria, and respect for what our family represents. As the door closed behind him, Isabella sank back into her chair, staring at the spot where the velvet box had been. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the room, and for the first time since becoming queen, she felt truly alone in the palace that had become her home. The royal dining room felt unusually tense as the family gathered for their evening meal. King Frederick sat at the head of the mahogany table, his weathered face showing the strain of recent palace politics. At 58, he had ruled Valdoria for over 2 decades, but family matters had always proven more challenging than affairs of state. Princess Victoria entered the dining room with her characteristic grace, her auburn hair catching the light from the crystal chandelier. She resembled her mother so strongly that sometimes it took King Frederick's breath away. The 17-year-old princess had Elena's gentle eyes but also her determined chin, a combination that promised both compassion and strength in her future role. Queen Isabella arrived last, her composure perfectly maintained despite the afternoon's conversation with Alexander. She had chosen her jewelry carefully for the evening, a simple diamond necklace that was undeniably beautiful but deliberately modest. She took her seat beside King Frederick, with the practiced elegance of someone who had mastered the art of royal deportment. Alexander waited until the first course was served before clearing his throat. Father, I have something important to discuss with the family. The formality of his tone immediately caught everyone's attention. Victoria looked up from her soup with curiosity while King Frederick set down his spoon entirely. What's on your mind, son? Frederick asked, though something in Alexander's expression suggested this wasn't going to be a simple announcement. Alexander reached into his jacket and placed the velvet box on the table beside his place setting. The sight of it made Victoria gasp softly. She recognized it as one of the boxes from the royal vault. though she had never been allowed to see its contents. "I've decided it's time for Mother's jewelry collection to return to active use," Alexander began. "These pieces have been locked away for too long, and I believe Mother would want them to serve their intended purpose." King Frederick's expression became guarded. He had been dreading this conversation for years, knowing that eventually decisions would need to be made about Elena's belongings. "That's a significant decision, Alexander. Have you thought through all the implications?" "I have," Alexander replied firmly. "I want to give the entire collection to Victoria." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Victoria dropped her spoon, which clattered against her bowl with a sharp sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room. Her eyes widened as she looked between her brother and father, trying to process what she had just heard. King Frederick leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. Queen Isabella continued eating her soup as if nothing had happened, but her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the spoon to her lips. "Alexander," Victoria whispered. "Are you serious?" Her brother smiled at her reaction. "Completely serious. These pieces belong to our mother, and now they belong to you." He opened the velvet box, revealing the sapphire necklace. The stones seemed to glow in the candlelight, and Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I can't accept this," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not ready for such responsibility. Queen Isabella should have Mother's jewelry. She's the queen." King Frederick finally found his voice. "Son, this is a decision that affects the entire royal family. Perhaps we should have discussed it privately before announcing it at dinner." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. "With respect, Father, I believe Mother's children should have a say in what happens to her belongings. This isn't a matter of royal protocol, it's personal." The king glanced at his wife, who was still maintaining her composed silence. He knew Isabella well enough to recognize the signs of her carefully controlled anger. "Isabella, what are your thoughts on this?" The queen finally looked up from her soup, meeting Frederick's eyes with a calm expression that revealed nothing of the turmoil underneath. "Alexander spoke with me this afternoon about his decision. While I admit I'm surprised by the choice, I respect his right to make it." Victoria reached across the table toward the velvet box, then stopped herself. "May I?" she asked softly. Alexander nodded, and Victoria carefully lifted the sapphire necklace from its resting place. The weight of it surprised her. Not just the physical weight of the precious stones, but the emotional weight of holding something that had been so important to the mother she barely remembered. "Tell me about this one," Victoria said, her voice barely audible. "Mother wore it to the opening of the children's hospital," Alexander explained. "She said the blue represented hope and healing. She spent the entire day with sick children, and in every photograph she's smiling as if there was nowhere else she'd rather be." Tears began flowing down Victoria's cheeks as she held the necklace. "I remember that day vaguely. I was so young, but I remember her coming home and telling me about a little boy who had been too shy to speak to her until she knelt down to his level." King Frederick watched his daughter with mixed emotions. The resemblance to Elena was striking, but more than that, Victoria's reaction to the jewelry showed the same emotional connection that Elena had always felt toward the people she served. "There are conditions," Alexander continued, his tone becoming more serious. "These pieces are not to be worn for vanity or status. They're tools for service, just as Mother used them. Each time you wear one, it should be with purpose and respect for what it represents." Victoria nodded solemnly, still cradling the necklace. "I understand. I want to use them the way Mother did, to honor the occasions and the people we serve." Queen Isabella finally spoke, her voice steady but cool. "And what about state functions? There will be times when protocol requires specific jewelry choices. Will Victoria's inexperience be adequate for such occasions?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander looked directly at his stepmother. "Victoria will learn just as Mother learned, and she'll have guidance from those who knew Mother best." King Frederick realized that this conversation was about much more than jewelry. It was about legacy, identity, and the future direction of the royal family. Alexander was essentially declaring that Elena's memory and values would continue to play an active role in the monarchy. Rather than being relegated to history, "Frederick," Isabella said quietly, "perhaps you should weigh in on this decision." The king looked around the table at his family, his son, determined and principled, his daughter, overwhelmed but eager to honor her mother's memory, and his wife, trying to maintain dignity while feeling excluded from a legacy she had hoped to claim. "The jewelry belongs to our family," Frederick said finally, but it specifically belonged to Elena, and Alexander is Elena's son. If he believes Victoria should inherit these pieces, then I will support that decision. Victoria carefully placed the necklace back in the box and stood up. Walking around the table, she embraced her brother tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise I'll make Mother proud." As the family finished their meal in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what this decision would mean. Outside the dining room, palace staff had already begun to whisper about the conversation they had partially overheard. By morning, the entire kingdom would know that Princess Elena's legendary jewelry collection was about to make its return to public life, worn by the daughter who carried her mother's name and, apparently, her brother's complete confidence in her ability to continue Elena's legacy. The news spread through Valdoria Palace like wildfire. By dawn, every servant, guard, and courtier knew that Princess Elena's jewelry collection was being passed to Princess Victoria. The kitchen staff whispered about it over breakfast preparations. The gardeners discussed it while tending the rose bushes, and the royal secretaries could barely focus on their morning correspondence. Queen Isabella had retreated to her private chambers immediately after dinner, dismissing her lady-in-waiting with an unusual curtness. She stood before her own jewelry collection, displayed in velvet-lined drawers that covered an entire wall of her dressing room. The pieces were magnificent. Some had belonged to queens for centuries, others were gifts from foreign dignitaries, and many were personal purchases that reflected her own refined taste. But as Isabella looked at her collection, she couldn't help but think about the pieces that were now beyond her reach. Elena's jewelry had a story, a connection to the people that Isabella's formal royal pieces simply couldn't match. The emerald bracelet that Elena had worn to the International Peace Summit, the pearl earrings from her first official portrait, the ruby brooch that had been a wedding gift from the people of Valdoria. Each piece carried memories that had made Elena legendary. A soft knock interrupted Isabella's brooding. "Come in," she called, expecting to see her lady-in-waiting. Instead, King Frederick entered, his expression troubled. He had changed from his formal dinner attire into a simple shirt and trousers, making him look more like a concerned husband than a reigning monarch. "I wanted to check on you," Frederick said gently, closing the door behind him. "I know tonight's announcement was unexpected." Isabella turned away from her jewelry display, facing her husband with a carefully controlled expression. "Was it unexpected, Frederick? Or did you know what Alexander was planning?" The king shook his head. "I had no idea. If I had, I would have insisted on a family discussion before any decisions were made." He moved closer to his wife, recognizing the hurt she was trying to hide. "Isabella, your position as queen isn't diminished by this decision, isn't it?" Isabella's composure finally cracked slightly. "For 15 years I've stood beside you at every state function, every diplomatic dinner, every royal ceremony. I've represented this kingdom with dignity and grace, and now a 17-year-old girl will be wearing the jewelry that the people associate with the golden age of the monarchy." Frederick reached for her hand, but Isabella stepped back. "You don't understand what this means for me, Frederick. Elena's jewelry isn't just about beauty or status. It's about connection to the people's hearts. When I wear my royal pieces, they see the institution. When Victoria wears Elena's jewelry, they'll see their beloved princess reborn." Down the hall, Victoria sat in her own room, staring at the velvet box that now rested on her dressing table. She had been afraid to open it again after dinner, overwhelmed by the responsibility that her brother had placed on her shoulders. The princess had always known that she would inherit some of her mother's belongings, but she had expected it to happen gradually. When she was older and more prepared, Alexander appeared in her doorway, having noticed the light under her door. "Having second thoughts?" he asked gently. Victoria looked up at her brother with uncertainty. "I keep thinking about what Queen Isabella said. What if I'm not ready? What if I make mistakes?" Alexander entered the room and sat beside his sister on the edge of her bed. "Mother made mistakes too, especially in the beginning, but she learned from them, and more importantly, she never stopped caring about the people she served." He paused, studying Victoria's worried expression. "Do you remember the story about Mother's first charity event?" Victoria shook her head and Alexander smiled. "She was 19, just 2 years older than you are now. She was supposed to give a speech at an orphanage, but when she got there, she forgot her prepared remarks completely. Instead of panicking, she sat down with the children and simply talked to them about their hopes and dreams. The newspapers called it the most genuine royal visit in decades. Really? Victoria asked, some of the anxiety leaving her voice. Really? Mother's greatest strength wasn't her perfection. It was her authenticity. She connected with people because she genuinely cared about them, not because she always knew the right thing to say or do. Victoria opened the jewelry box again, this time examining each piece more carefully. Besides the sapphire necklace, there was an emerald bracelet, a strand of pearls, a diamond tiara, and several smaller pieces. Each one was exquisite, but more importantly, each one had been chosen by Elena for specific reasons. Alexander, Victoria said slowly, what if Queen Isabella is right? What if wearing Mother's jewelry creates problems with palace protocol? Her brother considered the question seriously. Then we'll deal with those problems when they arise. Victoria, protocol exists to serve the monarchy, not the other way around. If Mother's jewelry helps you connect with the people and continue her charitable work, then that serves the greater good. Meanwhile, in the palace's staff quarters, the reaction to the evening's news was overwhelmingly positive. Margaret, the head housekeeper who had served the royal family for over 30 years, gathered her closest colleagues in the servants' hall. I remember when Princess Elena first wore that sapphire necklace, Margaret said, her eyes bright with memory. She was so nervous about the hospital opening, but when she put on that necklace, it was like she drew strength from it. She told me later that wearing her jewelry reminded her that she was representing something bigger than herself. Thomas, the elderly butler, nodded thoughtfully. The princess always said that her jewelry was borrowed from the people. She never forgot that her position came with responsibilities, not just privileges. The younger staff members listened intently to these stories. Most of them had been hired after Elena's death and knew her only through photographs and the reverent way the older staff spoke about her. Do you think Princess Victoria will be able to fill her mother's shoes? Asked Sarah, one of the newer maids. Margaret smiled warmly. That girl has her mother's heart. I've watched her grow up, and she has the same kindness, the same genuine concern for others. She'll find her own way to honor the jewelry and what it represents. Back in the royal chambers, King Frederick continued his conversation with Queen Isabella, who had finally allowed her frustration to show fully. I supported Alexander and Victoria through everything, Isabella said, pacing the length of her dressing room. I never tried to replace Elena's memory. I never demanded that they forget their mother. But I did hope that eventually I would be seen as more than just the woman who came after. Frederick felt the weight of his wife's words. He had indeed found love again with Isabella, and she had been an exemplary queen and stepmother. But he also understood that Elena's legacy was larger than any individual relationship or position. Isabella, he said carefully, your contributions to this family and kingdom stand on their own merit. You don't need Elena's jewelry to validate your place here. Don't I? Isabella stopped pacing and faced her husband directly. Frederick, I love Alexander and Victoria as if they were my own children. But after tonight, I feel like I'm always going to be the outsider, the one who came after the real queen. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. King Frederick opened it to find Princess Victoria standing in the hallway, still wearing her dinner dress but looking much younger than her 17 years. I'm sorry to interrupt, Victoria said quietly, but I wanted to speak with Queen Isabella. Isabella's expression softened immediately at the sight of the young princess. Despite her own hurt feelings, she genuinely loved this girl who had lost her mother so young. Of course, dear, Isabella said. Come in. Victoria entered the room hesitantly, clutching something in her hand. I've been thinking about what you said at dinner, about my inexperience with royal protocol. You're right. I don't know enough about state functions and diplomatic expectations. She opened her hand to reveal one of the smaller pieces from Elena's collection, a simple but elegant pearl brooch. I was hoping you might teach me about when to wear each piece, about what they represent, about how to honor Mother's memory properly. Isabella stared at the pearl brooch, recognizing it as one of Elena's favorites for smaller, more intimate royal functions. The gesture was unexpected and deeply moving. You want me to help you? Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria nodded earnestly. I can't do this alone, and you understand royal protocol better than anyone. I think Mother would want us to work together. For the first time since dinner, Queen Isabella smiled genuinely. Perhaps this wasn't about being replaced or forgotten. Perhaps it was about finding a new way to honor both the past and the present. 3 weeks after the family dinner that changed everything, Princess Victoria stood in front of her mirror while Queen Isabella fastened the clasp of the sapphire necklace. The two women had spent countless hours together during those weeks, with Isabella sharing stories about royal protocol, while Victoria absorbed every detail about her mother's approach to public service. "Remember," Isabella said softly, adjusting the necklace so it lay perfectly, "the jewelry should enhance your message, not become the message itself. Your mother understood that better than anyone." Victoria nodded, touching the sapphires gently. Today marked her first official public appearance wearing Elena's jewelry, the reopening of the children's hospital that her mother had originally opened 15 years ago. The symbolism was powerful and the entire kingdom was watching. "I'm nervous," Victoria admitted, meeting Isabella's eyes in the mirror. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if people compare me to Mother and find me lacking?" Isabella placed her hands on Victoria's shoulders, surprised by how natural this mentoring role had become. "Your mother was nervous too, every single time. She told me once that the day she stopped being nervous about public appearances would be the day she stopped caring about doing them well." The relationship between the two women had transformed dramatically over the past weeks. What had begun as Victoria's diplomatic request for help had evolved into genuine affection and mutual respect. Isabella had discovered that teaching Victoria about royal protocol gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't expected, while Victoria had found in her stepmother a guide who understood both the demands of royal life and the weight of Elena's legacy. Alexander had watched this development with satisfaction and relief. His decision to give the jewelry to Victoria had been about more than honoring their mother's memory. It had been about creating a bridge between the past and future of their family. Seeing Victoria and Isabella work together had validated his belief that the right choice could bring healing rather than division. King Frederick had observed the growing partnership between his wife and daughter with amazement. He had worried that Alexander's decision might create permanent tension in the family, but instead, it had given Isabella a new role that utilized her experience while allowing Victoria to learn from someone who truly understood the complexities of royal life. As the royal car approached the children's hospital, crowds lined the streets. Many people held photographs of Princess Elena from her original hospital visit, while others carried flowers and handmade signs welcoming Princess Victoria. The sight of Elena's daughter returning to continue her mother's work had captured the public imagination in a way that surprised even the royal press secretaries. "Look at all these people," Victoria whispered, peering out the car window. "They loved Mother so much." "They did," Isabella agreed. "But Victoria, they're not here just because of your mother's memory. They're here because they believe in what you represent, the continuation of her values and compassion." Inside the hospital, Director Dr. Matthews waited nervously. He had been a young resident when Princess Elena had first visited, and he remembered her genuine interest in the children's well-being. He hoped that Princess Victoria would bring the same authentic concern to her visit. When Victoria stepped out of the car, the crowd's reaction was immediate and emotional. Many people gasped audibly when they saw the sapphire necklace catching the afternoon sunlight. It was the first time Elena's jewelry had been seen in public since her death. But what struck observers most was not the jewelry itself, but how naturally Victoria wore it, as if she had been born to carry on her mother's work. The first stop inside the hospital was the children's ward, where young patients had been preparing for weeks for the princess's visit. Victoria had insisted on spending real time with the children, rather than simply making a ceremonial appearance. She sat on tiny chairs, listened to stories, and even helped with an art project that the children had designed specifically for her visit. "Your necklace is beautiful," said Emma, a 7-year-old patient who was recovering from surgery. "It's the same color as the sky on a happy day." Victoria smiled, remembering Alexander's story about their mother and the significance of the blue sapphires. "That's exactly right, Emma. My mother chose this necklace because she said blue represents hope and healing." Dr. Matthews watched from the doorway, amazed by Victoria's natural rapport with the children. She had inherited not just her mother's jewelry, but also Elena's ability to connect with people on a genuine level. The princess listened intently to each child, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed completely comfortable in the hospital environment. Outside the hospital, Reporters and photographers captured every moment of Victoria's visit. The images they created would soon appear on front pages across the kingdom and beyond. The young princess wearing her mother's legendary necklace, surrounded by smiling children, continuing a legacy of compassion that had defined Elena's reign. But it was during the dedication ceremony for the hospital's new wing that Victoria truly showed her growth. Standing at the podium wearing her mother's sapphires, she delivered a speech that Isabella had helped her prepare, but that came from her own heart. 15 years ago, my mother stood in this same place and spoke about hope. Victoria began, her voice clear and confident. She believed that caring for our most vulnerable citizens, especially children, was not just a royal duty, but a moral imperative for our entire society. The audience listened in rapt attention as Victoria continued. Today I'm honored to continue her work, not because I am trying to replace her, but because I believe the values she represented are timeless. Compassion, service, and genuine care for others should guide every generation of our royal family. In the royal viewing area, Isabella felt tears well up in her eyes. The young woman at the podium was finding her own voice while honoring her mother's memory. Alexander stood beside his stepmother, both of them recognizing that Victoria was becoming the leader they had hoped she could be. King Frederick watched his daughter with immense pride. She had grown so much in just 3 weeks, not just in her understanding of royal protocol, but in her confidence and sense of purpose. The jewelry had indeed become a tool for service, just as Elena had intended. After the ceremony, as the royal family mingled with hospital staff and donors, countless people approached Victoria to share memories of her mother. But what surprised everyone was how many people also spoke about Victoria herself, about her genuine warmth, her thoughtful questions, and her obvious commitment to the causes she was supporting. "Princess Victoria," said Mrs. Henderson, an elderly volunteer who had worked at the hospital for decades, "you have your mother's heart, but you also have your own strength. Today, watching you with those children, I saw the future of our monarchy, and it filled me with hope." As the royal car returned to the palace that evening, Victoria carefully removed the sapphire necklace and held it in her hands. "Isabella," she said quietly, "thank you for helping me understand what this really means." Queen Isabella smiled, feeling more content than she had in years. "Thank you for letting me be part of continuing your mother's legacy. Today I saw Elena in you, but I also saw the unique person you're becoming." The newspapers the next morning would declare Victoria's debut a resounding success. Editorial writers praised her natural grace, her obvious preparation, and her authentic connection with the people she met. But perhaps more importantly, they noted how the return of Elena's jewelry had brought a sense of continuity and hope to the monarchy. Palace staff reported that the switchboard had been flooded, with calls from citizens expressing their support for Princess Victoria and their appreciation for seeing Elena's jewelry being used for its intended purpose. Charitable organizations across the kingdom began reaching out, hoping to involve the young princess in their work. That night, as Victoria carefully placed the sapphire necklace back in its velvet box, she thought about the day's events. She had worn her mother's jewelry not as a costume or decoration, but as a symbol of responsibility and service. For the first time since Alexander had given her the collection, she felt truly worthy of the trust he had placed in her. The decision that had once seemed to threaten the royal family's unity had instead created new bonds and renewed purpose. Victoria was finding her voice as a future leader. Isabella had discovered a meaningful role in shaping that development, and the monarchy had gained a sense of continuity that connected Elena's beloved memory with the promise of the future. 6 months had passed since Alexander's decision had transformed the royal family, and the changes were visible throughout the kingdom. Princess Victoria had become a beloved figure in her own right, wearing her mother's jewelry to charitable events, state functions, and diplomatic meetings with a grace that surprised even her most ardent supporters. The emerald bracelet had accompanied her to an environmental summit where she spoke passionately about conservation efforts. The pearl earrings had been her choice for a cultural exchange with visiting dignitaries. Each piece of Elena's collection had found new life and purpose, serving exactly the role that Princess Elena had always envisioned for royal jewelry. Queen Isabella had emerged from the experience as a different person entirely. Rather than feeling displaced by Victoria's inheritance, She had discovered a new identity as a mentor and guide. The royal press had begun referring to her as the queen who bridges generations, recognizing her unique role in helping Victoria navigate the complexities of royal life while honoring Elena's legacy. The relationship between Victoria and Isabella had deepened beyond mere protocol instruction. They had become genuine confidants, with Isabella offering wisdom gained from years of royal experience, and Victoria bringing fresh perspectives that energized Isabella's own approach to her duties. Their public appearances together had become some of the most popular royal events, showing a united family that honored both tradition and progress. King Frederick watched these developments with profound satisfaction. The decision that had initially worried him had instead strengthened his family in ways he hadn't anticipated. Alexander's wisdom in giving the jewelry to Victoria had created bonds that mere time could never have accomplished. Alexander himself had gained new respect throughout the kingdom for his handling of the situation. Political commentators praised his decision as a masterful move that had simultaneously honored his mother's memory, empowered his sister, included his stepmother, and strengthened the monarchy's connection to the people. What some had initially viewed as a potentially divisive family decision had instead become a template for how royal families could navigate complex emotional and political terrain. The transformation was perhaps most visible during the kingdom's annual Unity Day celebration. Princess Victoria wore the complete sapphire set, necklace, earrings, and bracelet that had been Elena's signature collection. But rather than simply replicating her mother's appearance, Victoria had worked with Isabella to create a look that honored the past while reflecting her own emerging style. As Victoria addressed the crowd from the palace balcony, wearing Elena's sapphires but speaking with her own voice, the symbolism was unmistakable. The jewelry connected her to her mother's legacy, but her words and presence were entirely her own. Today, we celebrate not just our unity as a kingdom, but our commitment to the values that define us, Victoria declared, her voice carrying clearly across the vast crowd below. Compassion, service, and genuine care for one another are not just royal duties. They are the foundation of our shared identity. In the crowd below, people held signs and banners expressing their support for the young princess. Many had brought photographs of Princess Elena, but an equal number displayed new images of Victoria from her recent charitable work. The kingdom had found a way to honor their beloved former princess while embracing their future queen. The international media had taken notice as well. Royal correspondents from across Europe wrote glowing articles about the Valdorian royal family's handling of what could have been a divisive inheritance issue. The story of Alexander's decision, Victoria's growth, and Isabella's gracious mentorship had become a model for how modern monarchies could balance tradition with evolution. Behind the scenes, the palace staff continued to share stories about the positive changes they had witnessed. Margaret, the head housekeeper, often remarked to her colleagues about how the atmosphere in the palace had lightened considerably since the jewelry had returned to active use. "It's as if Princess Elena's spirit has returned to the palace," Margaret would say, "not as a ghost from the past, but as a living influence that guides Princess Victoria and brings out the best in Queen Isabella." The jewelry itself had taken on an almost legendary status. Each public appearance featuring one of Elena's pieces generated significant media coverage, but more importantly, it drew attention to the causes Victoria was supporting. Charitable organizations reported increased donations and volunteer applications whenever Princess Victoria appeared at their events. Wearing her mother's jewelry, Dr. Matthews, at the Children's Hospital, had kept detailed records of the impact of Victoria's continued involvement. The hospital had received its largest donation in history following Victoria's dedication ceremony, and several new programs had been funded specifically because of the attention her visit had generated. "Princess Victoria has brought her mother's caring spirit back to our hospital," Dr. Matthews reported to the Royal Press Office. "But she's also brought her own energy and fresh ideas. The children love her visits, and the staff finds her genuine interest in their work incredibly motivating." As the first year of Victoria's public service drew to a close, the royal family gathered once again in the same dining room where Alexander had made his announcement. This time, however, the mood was celebratory rather than tense. "I want to thank you all," Victoria said, addressing her family while wearing the simple pearl brooch that had become her signature piece for family gatherings. Alexander, your trust in me changed my life and gave me purpose I never knew I had. Isabella, your guidance has made me not just a better princess, but a better person. And Father, your support has given me the confidence to grow into this role. King Frederick raised his glass in a toast. To Princess Elena, whose legacy continues to inspire us all. To Alexander, whose wisdom brought healing to our family. To Isabella, whose grace has guided our future. And to Victoria, who has proven that the best way to honor the past is to build a meaningful future. Queen Isabella felt a profound sense of peace as she participated in the toast. The jewelry that had once represented her exclusion from Elena's legacy had instead become the bridge that connected her more deeply to the royal family than she had ever dreamed possible. Alexander looked around the table at his family, his father, proud and content, his stepmother, fulfilled in her new role as mentor, and his sister, radiant with purpose and confidence. His decision to give Elena's jewelry to Victoria had accomplished everything he had hoped and more. The broader impact of Alexander's choice continued to ripple through the kingdom. Young people, in particular, had embraced Princess Victoria as a role model who represented both respect for tradition and commitment to progress. University students organized charity events in her honor, and youth organizations invited her to speak about service and leadership. The royal family's approval ratings had reached historic highs, with public opinion polls showing overwhelming support for Victoria's work and appreciation for the family's handling of Elena's legacy. Political analysts noted that the monarchy had successfully navigated a potentially divisive transition while actually strengthening their connection to the people. The evening concluded, and the family members retired to their respective chambers. Each carried with them a sense of accomplishment and unity that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. Victoria carefully stored her pearl brooch in the jewelry box that had become a symbol of her mother's enduring influence. While Isabella planned the next day's protocol lessons with genuine enthusiasm, Alexander's decision had indeed been a powerful move that had silenced doubts, critics, and tensions within the royal family. By choosing love over politics, family over protocol, and service over status, he had created a legacy worthy of his mother's memory and a foundation strong enough to support his family's future. The return of Diana's jewels, or in this case, Elena's jewels, had become more than just the restoration of beautiful objects to public view. It had become a masterclass in how families, even royal ones, could navigate complex emotions and competing interests with wisdom, grace, and ultimately love. As the palace settled into peaceful quiet that night, the sapphire necklace rested safely in its velvet box, ready for whatever worthy cause Princess Victoria would support next. The jewelry had indeed found its rightful place, not locked away in a vault, not as symbols of past glory, but as active tools in the ongoing work of building a more compassionate and unified kingdom. Prince Alexander's powerful move had accomplished exactly what he had intended. It had honored his mother's memory, empowered his sister, included his stepmother, strengthened his family, and served his kingdom. Most importantly, it had proven that sometimes the most courageous decisions are the ones that choose love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, and hope over hesitation.